Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles Sirtwell. I'm the president of the Northern Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm supposed to quickly thank our partners for this evening and then pass the microphone over to your speaker and then hopefully off to engaging you in a conversation. So before I forget, let me thank the CBC and CESME for sponsoring this event, our first Policy in a Pub evening, and hopefully not our last, will depend on how the success is. They tell me that there's a feedback form, a handwritten one over there for the old-fashioned folks, and apparently there's one online, and rumor has it there's something you can scan here and get immediate access to it. I don't know, where's that at? Over that way too. So for those of you who understand scan and type, there you go, you're all set. Also want to thank SHIP for encouraging their members to come out this evening and have a chat about the Mid-Canada Corridor. And so, John, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you without getting into the belabored introduction, which you told me not to get into, other than to tell you he's highly qualified and experienced in all of these areas and is an interesting discussant on this subject matter, which I hope you can explain better than I can, because I've been trying to explain it for 6 weeks now and I still haven't got it right. So, good luck.
Thanks, Charles. It's actually really interesting that I'm here because in the whole process of the Mid-Canada Plan, which I'm going to talk about, and actually I now call it the Boreal Corridor because I had this, it all grew out of an article I wrote in Walrus, which by the way I bought a few copies of it, people didn't catch that. And I had it translated into French, or somebody translated it into French, and it came back, instead of saying Mid-Canada, they said the Boreal Corridor, Corridor Boreal. And I thought, wow, that's much nicer than Mid-Canada. So now I'm sort of caught. I don't know whether to call it Mid-Canada, which is its original name. It's an idea that was put on the table by Richard Romer, and maybe being put back on as the Boreal Corridor, because the geography of the corridor is in fact very aligned with the boreal forest, which of course goes from coast to coast. So I wrote the article, but then I was invited. I'm not a policy person. I'm actually an urban planner and an architect. But I worked in various parts of the world, which I'll talk a little bit about, on the whole impact of resource development on existing communities, basically. That's our role. So we're conventional architects and planners. We have a practice in Toronto. We build buildings, we make plans. We worked on the Northern Growth Plan. Actually, we're quite involved in that, in the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. But we also work in Africa. We have an office in Dakar, and in South America, we have an office in Ecuador. It's a firm that I founded in 1978 on my own, and we're now about 80 people in Toronto or in the other 3 offices. So I wrote the article. I'll just say that my connection is partly that my grandfather was a surveyor. And he finished the colonial surveys from Timmins up to James Bay. And he spoke fluent Cree, and he knew exactly how to live off the land, and I learned quite a bit from him, and I was influenced by that, and I probably should have gone into surveying, but I ended up going into architecture and then planning. And of course, they're all related because they're all part of I started a firm that I can now explain what we were trying to do because somebody gave me a picture of my grandfather graduating in 1898 from the University of Toronto, and he's sitting on the front steps with 30 to 40 other men, I have to say. And the sign said, School of Practical Sciences. And I said to my aunt, well actually, he's a surveyor. He had to be in engineering. That must have been some kind of club they had at the university. And she said, no, I'm pretty sure that was his graduating picture. So I looked up the School of Practical Sciences, and sure enough, the School of Practical Sciences in 1898 at U of T was indeed all the engineering sciences, plus architecture, plus planning, plus landscape architecture, plus land surveying, plus land economics. And it said all the sciences you need to plan cities with. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It explained to me what I actually felt about what had happened, which is that over the next 50 years, that faculty split off into separate professions, separate faculties, separate professional organizations, all of which I would have to say war against each other. The architects don't like the planners don't believe architects can ever do any kind of architecture. The engineers, are pretty sure architects and planners are all out to lunch. But I decided to set up a firm that actually brings all those professions together. So that's what we do, and I don't know what to call it. Maybe it's just practical sciences. Anyway, it's not policy. I'm not a policy person, but I wrote this article, and then I got a phone call from the NDP in Ottawa saying, could you come up and talk about this notion, because we're getting ready for the next election, and we'd like to hear more. So I prepared this version of the lecture, which is I tried to gear in my very amateur way towards what are the implications of the article and what happened for national policy, not to mention provincial and local policies as well. So here it is. It's sort of, and I hope that it meets your expectations in terms of you being the Northern Policy Group. Next. So just a word, this is not meant to be promotional, it's just to say that we do work around the world, and largely in resource areas, that is in our overseas work, in different parts of the world. And there are lots of course, Canada is a leading country in terms of financing and investing in resource development in all parts of the world. That's got a whole interesting dimension to it, because when we work in the developing countries, part of our work is governed by the IFC guidelines, which actually were set when the IFC in the 60s invested in some large-scale dam projects in India, all of which ended up flooding out tens of thousands of people. And they said, hold it, we've got to do some guidelines on how to look at this from a social point of view and do it correctly. So there are these IFC guidelines for sustainable development. The IFC is the lending arm of the World Bank, for those of you who don't know. And actually those guidelines are extremely interesting. In fact, 2 years ago when the Mining Act for Ontario was being revised and we had a session in Toronto, I took the guidelines and I said, they're all here. And you should just build these into a Mining Act for Ontario. And they said, well, no, actually, what we're really focusing on is talking with First Nations. And I said, well, if you read these guidelines, you'll see that what they require is full and informed consultation with all affected parties, all Indigenous people, renters, squatters, whoever you run into in the developing countries you work in. You have to consult with them fully, and you have to prepare a plan that addresses their needs, and you have to deposit it for 90 days in their community so they can review it and critique it, and then you revise it and you make a plan that works for them, the mining companies, the affected parties, and everything. So these are guidelines that are quite phenomenal, but the same companies who have to work with them in Peru or Senegal do not have to apply them here in Canada, because of course we're a developed country. So we should know all those rules already. But of course we don't know them, and we don't follow them at all. In fact, I think not too long ago, 6 chiefs up here went to jail for protesting that some exploration people showed up on the reserve without any kind of invitation. But of course, it turned out they were allowed to do that. So it's a very interesting time for me to be actually looking back at Canada and what are we doing for resources and Native people and our own people, and how are we, what are our guidelines that we're going to follow in the next while. So in the process, I ran into Richard Romer's. I remember Richard Romer had this Mid-Canada Corridor plan in the 1968. Prime Minister Trudeau. Now Richard Romer is a arch conservative. In fact, I'll tell you a story. Is that I was, when the article finished and had come out, I got a phone call 2 days later, and there was a voice on the phone, and they said, "You don't know who this is, do you?" And I said, "It's I don't know." And he said, "You thought I was dead, didn't you?" And I said, "My God, I did think you were dead." And he said, "No, I'm a 90-year-old lawyer, and I'm sitting at my desk in Collingwood, and I'm thrilled that you've written this article, and I'm going to send it to the Prime Minister and tell him he's got to get off his butt." But when he first announced it, Prime Minister Trudeau had just been elected, so he wasn't interested as he may have been. He couldn't afford to be because he had his own policies to launch. So what Richard Romer did is join up with a firm called Acres, who were famous because they disappeared off the map for their overseas activities, were famous and large consulting group. So Acres Consulting and Richard put together the Mid-Canada Corridor Plan. And they held 2 conferences here at Lakehead. I think it was in 1969 or 1970, to bring, because this was deemed to be the center of the Mid-Canada. And if anything was going to start, it should start here in Thunder Bay. And so maybe some of you were at that conference or those conferences, but I read the minutes and they were extremely interesting. So I'm wandering as usual. So these are the main rapidly growing resource regions of the world. You know, we did a plan for the oil sands for Treasury Board Alberta when they realized it was a 300-year resource and they hadn't put any investment in it as a province. So we did the plan to what they should be investing in infrastructure over the next 50 years in order to take advantage of this resource. And they acted as if they were the only resource or region in the world. And I pointed out, I did this map for them to say, well, actually you're one of a number of major resource regions in the world. And we've worked in many of those and at a kind of regional level. Next. So these are drawings from the actual original Mid-Canada Corridor Plan and just highlight the kind of main points about it. So Romer's statement was, you know, the majority of Canadians live within 300 miles of the border. So if we take that line and then we take the tree line, he said that's Mid-Canada. And that region, so there it is, defined carefully as a light gray area, and then showing the vegetation. And you can see the green, the dark green there that comes across there is the boreal forest. So it's also a major environmental sink, and hence the notion, the sort of contemporary idea of calling this the boreal corridor, I think makes a lot of sense. So, and you can see it clearly, and he said it's not only defined that way, but it's also temperate and habitable. So it contains 75% of our wealth, of our untapped wealth in terms of minerals and forest products, etc. And it contains 75% of our Aboriginal people, and it's habitable. So you, Mr. Trudeau, should be doing a plan for this that shows how that will unfold because this is going to be our most important economic belt over the next 50 years. So 50 years later, when I read this plan, I sort of got together and plotted out, so what's actually happened without a plan? Next. Sorry, there's the wealth. You can see the sort of distribution of the forests and mining in the corridor itself. Home to 75% of our Aboriginal population, which are those dots. And he said, of course, it needs a plan. And the plan was to create these, in a very conceptual way, to create these major new corridors, which would serve it and bring it together. And he said, well, I look at it this way, that the 300 miles is kind of the first stage of the settlement of Canada, or the first stage of development in Canada. And we're quite aware of the far north, in northern Canada, but we kind of forget the middle. We've forgotten it almost completely. And yet, if you really look at what's going on, it's full of all kinds of critical activity that is happening in spite of the lack of planning, and in fact is sort of leading the way. And you know, I did get invited to the Liberal caucus as well after this when I heard I'd been at the NDP. Of course, I wanted to talk about it. And it was really interesting to go to the NDP caucus because there was a map on the table. And I said, well, that's really welcoming. You've got a map of the Mid-Canada corridor here. They said, no, that actually those are just our constituencies. And actually, if you look at the NDP constituencies, they go from one end of the country to the other in that corridor. There are a couple in the cities. And the Liberals said, well, you know, what's this got to do with the cities? And I said, well, I think, as far as I know, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, they're all based on resources flowing down from financing projects in mid-Canada. So it's a lot to do with those. And what you do here, so there's an effect both ways here, if I can describe it that way. Next. So here's the map that appeared in the article, which shows the corridor again, and just to try and give you some sense of what is going on in there. Well, it starts with the Northern Gateway, which you've heard a lot about. I'm starting in BC. The LNG facilities in northwestern BC are at one end there. Of course, there's lots of activity going on in the Northwest Territories, from Yellowknife right up to Tuck in that belt, mining in the Yukon, etc. Then we move into the entire oil sands, the Athabasca oil sands, the Cold Lake oil sands are in that belt. The oil sands of Saskatchewan and the northern part of their potash deposits are there. Then we have northern Manitoba, where we worked for 2 years in the Thompson region, which is rich in nickel and remains that way, the whole basin there. Then, of course, and I'm at the Ontario Mining Forum today and tomorrow, which is focusing on the Ring of Fire for the 5th year in a row. There are a few fewer people there, but actually what was surprising today is the amazing activity that's going on around there. And I'll come back to that later, but I thought it was off the table, but it's quite interesting. So that's coming, and then of course you have the Timmins and nickel, the Timmins and Sudbury belts, which have been there since 1905. Extremely active still. There's re-mining going on. We're actually working right now on the re-mining of the Hollinger mine, which was shut down in 1978, and it's another interesting story. So they shut it down, but then what happened, and it started happening in the 80s and 90s, it was a deep mine. It's a very famous mine. Whenever I go to South Africa or other parts of the country, they'll say, "Do you know the Hollinger mine?" I said, "Yeah, I did." Well, it was the first deep mine in the world. So people came here to study it, especially how to cool the mine below. And so people learned a lot from it. But when it closed, what happened, the worst case that happened is an entire parking lot of used cars disappeared one day down a hole. And lots of pieces of Timmins were doing the same in the old mine. So MNDM said, "No, you got to close this properly. This is not." And it turned out to close it was going to cost them $100 million to sort of fill in all those stopes and make it right. So they said, "Well, geez, maybe there's still some gold in there. We should go back and look to see maybe we could just do a bit more mining and pay for the closure." They went back in and they found 2 to 3 million ounces in the top 400 feet that had been left behind because the grades were extremely high. The grades that are left are still, relatively speaking, high. So they're now going to dig a pit and re-mine it. And a very, very valuable resource still. So, and then we move up to the iron ore in Labrador City and the nickel in the north and Boise's Bay, and of course over to the oil and gas in Newfoundland and off. So that's the belt. So it's extremely active, and lots going on, lots of people moving back and forth, at least not so much the oil sands now, but back and forth, and has taken, so I decided this is really interesting, I'll write the article, basically. And that shows you a bit more in terms of regionally what's going on in which locations, to give you a better picture. So the whole idea of doing a plan for it, I started to think about that again, and I know I quickly dismissed the idea that you can do a national plan for this. That I could go to Mr. Rickford or Mr. Harper, but I don't think they're going to motivate for a national plan. But the question became for me, what could you do? Because this is an important belt. It's an important resource. It's driving the country. We're growing. I think we're the fastest growing country in the G8. Probably one of you is going to correct me on that, but as far as I know, we are, and that's 70 to 80% immigration. We used to have a policy that immigrants who came here had to go and spend their first 2 years in a forestry or mining situation. My Lithuanian friends, grew up in Geraldton, for example, because their father was sent there to work in the forestry works. We don't have that anymore, so but immigrants do tend to go to the resource areas because there's business and there's work there. So I began to think about this, and then I started to look at precedents. What were kind of plans like this that might have worked? And it took me back to the prairies. So when the resource was wheat, what did we do? Well, it's actually really interesting next. We actually planned for it. So first of all, we surveyed the southern prairies. I always thought the railways my knowledge of the railways was they were just racing across the country to get to Vancouver. I never thought, well, why were they going to Vancouver? Well, actually, they weren't going to Vancouver. They were eventually going there, but they were going out to the wheat areas. And they had sent agronomists out in 1870 to study, to tell them where the wheat was. The first one that went out was Palliser, very famous name. They went out on behalf of the Crown to survey the southern corridor, so right up against, which is really actually, well, he came back, he did his loop, the Palliser Circle, and he came back and said, you'll never grow wheat there. It was a drought year. In fact, it is at the top of the mid-American desert. And he was out one of those years when it was particularly dry. But a few years later, the Grand Trunk, or the other organization, sent their agronomists out a little further north, so Saskatchewan, Edmonton, that way. And within 3 days, he was writing back saying, this is fantastic wheat country, and we must, and he started to stake out where the railway would be. But he was doing that over top of, well, that time he was doing it before any of this, but the Dominion Lands Department got in and surveyed it right away. And what they did is they introduced the principle of using land to pay for the infrastructure and for the development. So land was allocated to the Hudson's Bay Company, who were critical in terms of providing services and goods and provisioning. The railway company to build the railway, schools for schools, and then the white areas where settlers could go. But the whole idea here was that the whole area would be settled, and the railways could sell off the land to pay for the railway. So in fact, they were allocated about 10,000 acres of land for every mile of railway, and the sale of that land was deemed to eventually pay for that mile of railway, etc. And the Hudson's Bay Company got their own income. So that was a kind of notion, very interesting one, of laying out the sections with the roads. Next. So what happened here is actually, so there is the first railway corridor. I'm just going to show you this rather quickly, but you can see that, so the railways own 10 acres either side of the railway. That was the 10,000 acres per mile corridor. So you can see that this is in 1886. That first corridor heading out to the west up to Prince Rupert and back into Winnipeg and through Regina. So you can see that the legend there, area within 10 miles of distribution of rural population, each dot represents 100 people, occupied area within the 10 miles of the railway, and then railways outside the occupied area. It actually, while these are the major railways, it spawned an awful lot of other railways that would run north-south as opposed to east-west. So there you are in 1886. Next. There you are in 1901. So these are short period, 1896, 1901. In a relatively short period, this is happening very, very rapidly, but in a reasonably organized way. And there it is, 1911, 1921. Now, what happened as well is the railway companies, the wheat producers said, well, of course, for the wheat, we have to have elevators. So, but we have a rule that every elevator, you have to be able to get to the farthest farm and back at harvest time in October in one day, because we can't afford in the scheduling to have people stuck out somewhere and we don't know when they're going to get back. We have to run this efficiently. So that was deemed to be a 4-mile radius to get back out to the furthest area in October and back into their elevator. So what happened is there were elevators laid out at every 8 miles, and many of you are probably familiar with this. But then someone had the brilliant idea, that must have been the planner who graduated in 1898, of laying a town plan around every elevator, because he or she observed that if people are going to, if the train's going to stop, they're going to load up, people are going to get off, and they're going to want to settle, and they're going to need some place to start with. And the government even went as far as in places like Regina to build buildings that settlers could live in for up to a year while they got settled. Now, not everybody experienced that, because in smaller towns, you were just let up, you just jumped off the train took off, and you arrived at a sod house or whatever you could scrape together. But it was highly organized, and definitely driven by the federal government. So this whole notion that the federal government can't do much for us in kind of resource development where the resource is now not wheat, but minerals and oil and gas, I started to wonder about, because maybe there is something we could do. And there it is by 1931. So really significant. And of course, we've been working we did this plan for the oil sands called the Comprehensive Regional Infrastructure Plan for the Athabasca oil sands and then the Cold Lake oil sands. And I didn't realize all this up until then. But of course, it's only southern Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, and southern Alberta that are really settled. And we bid for the job, and I said, what we're really going to look at is how to settle northern Alberta. Because right now you're just cowboys. You're just mining like brains out. It's sort of like, after the fact, you're in there with license areas all over the place, but so far you've bred, at that point, this would be in 2006, you've created 36 mine camps for workers, but nothing long-term. And in fact, we looked into the mine camps, the fly-in, because as you know, it's a fly-in, fly-out economy, unlike the original wheat one, which is you move in and you stay. And I'll tell you that in other parts of the world, when they tried to do that, so in Africa, when Barrick has a mine, and they start to, and they negotiate with the government in Tanzania, for example, to open up that mine. Of course, everybody's keen because it's going to create an economy for the country, and it's going to create jobs for all the people who live there, and it's going to create a whole new, pole for development. But what happens secondly is, the next thing that happens is, down the road come trailers from ATCO. And then workers from South Asia, or fly-in workers from Canada. And those people immediately, the local people immediately close the mine down, the operations down, because they're saying, well, hold it, what's going on here? You're bringing all this in, this is supposed to be our economy. And in fact, those camps have caused enormous problems because they're also, workers are fed, laundered, served drinks, entertained, all by sort of very large multinational corporations that provide those kinds of services. There's nothing in them for local populations. So we've been for the last 20 years, in fact, reversing that and saying that, in fact, you know what happens at a mine site? You go in and build a camp first for the people that construct it, and then afterwards you create an operations town for the people who operate it in the long run. The fact is, in Africa, those camps become slums because nobody's ever going to get rid of them, and by the time they want to get rid of them, they're already occupied by people who don't have housing, and you've got drinking and prostitution and the whole sort of criminal element. What happens if we build the operations town to begin with? But we'll build that first, and the construction workers, sort of like the athletes in the Olympics, living in a village up in Whistler, and then afterwards it became a village for the workers in Whistler. That was after the fact. I didn't know that was going to happen. But that whole idea, we build the town first, so it's a normalized urban setting in which local people run the stores. It's like, I'm jumping around here. I use the analogy, it's not an analogy, it's the truth. I use the analogy of a Western town. Those starter towns, and there were 700 of them in Saskatchewan, became the communities that we know today. But gradually, over time, in a way that could be afforded by governments and could be afforded by the people themselves. So we called it a starter town, and that's what we do there. But in the oil sands, and our policy, by the way, for the oil sands encourages starter towns to replace camps. In the camps, you've got now 92 camps in the oil sands. So if you're living in Lac La Biche, within a half an hour are 6 different camps. We commissioned a firm in Calgary. We knew the answer, but we knew if we did the research, they wouldn't believe us. We commissioned and said, well, what much does it cost for the camp? What are the expenses for the company? Well, when you factor in the fly-in, fly-out cost, with over 10 years, and by the way, they don't last 10 years. They have to be rebuilt after about 6 or 7 years. You're lucky. It's $1 billion. So you're spending $5 billion around Lac La Biche. By the way, we're paying for it because that's known as the cost of mining. So it's deducted from the royalties. It comes off the top. So we're actually subsidizing this. And it's crazy. So we say, well, hold it. Give me $250,000 for each of the camps, and we can build a pretty nice starter town. And that is the policy that's beginning to take hold out there now. But the point is, and there's the starter town in the wheat, to go back to the story here. So you can see the elevators and the typical town plan that crosses the prairies. And you know what's so interesting now to me is that with the potash development, we have 1,700 towns, small towns in Canada. 700 of them are in the southern prairies. And the potash development is happening there. Well, Saskatchewan's really, really interesting now because it has a very diverse economy. It's actually used the original oil money and the potash money to reinvest that in agriculture. It now, for instance, supplies all the lentils eastern to the Middle East, to Lebanon and Israel. The main lentil supply comes from, so they've diversified into all kinds of legumes and beans, etc. So they now don't just ship the canola out, they take the oil out and ship the oil, which is worth 4 times as much. They do the things that we should be doing as a country, but we don't ever. We'd like to ship the oil to Houston and buy it back, in fact, as far as I can see. So now with the current wave of mining and potash development, all these towns are becoming homes, but they've slightly gone down from an agricultural point of view as farms got bigger and people moved out. Now they're coming back because the mining populations and even the First Nations who are growing rapidly are moving into former colonial towns to take up residence there, and the whole place is sort of coming back around the same kind of infrastructure. So it's absolutely fascinating. But this is where it started, and there's the typical picture that we know from the prairies. Next. And there's one of those towns, Tisdale, but they're all very much the same, and you can see that plan in effect there. Next. So that was all interesting, but I then try to say, so what's the opportunity here for us today? What do we do about all this? It's an interesting story, and but what does it mean for our policy, and what does it mean for our economy? And I may be a planner and an architect, but I've come to understand. I think I learned it from Jane Jacobs, but I think I did, yeah. That it really is just about economy, and where the economy is where you need planning, and where you need eventually architecture, if you need them at all. And most parts of the world get along pretty well without them, but they go to where the economy is, and that's where development happens. But here, we're supposed to be more organized. Well, we're a developing country. In fact, I would say we're still a colonial country, really. We still believe that surveying and planning can get us out of trouble. I would say that what you could do, the opportunities to adopt Mid-Canada or the Boreal Corridor as a policy priority. So remember, I was gearing this to the upcoming election. In fact, I still am. I'm not here politicking, by the way, but I'm just telling you what I think. Build Mid-Canada into your narrative and frame the issue. Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal partnerships, mining and environment, not mining or environment, jobs and economy, infrastructure and housing. So it's not enough just to take the last one, just to invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure just brings housing and development, and you need to think of the whole situation together to make sense out of it. And actually, can I just go back? What we should really be doing as Canada is setting a model, at least if we are a developing country, the least we could do, because we have the money, is to set a model that's applicable in other developing countries. We should be showing the way on how to turn these kind of economies into really meaningful development. So the federal government can play and should play a more active role in Mid-Canada with effective planning and policy related to these federal issues. Aboriginal rights, economic development, and resource extraction, although there's an overlap with the provinces there, of course. Immigration, environment, infrastructure, housing, and social services, so through CMHC, those latter ones. So there's a whole interesting potential there at a federal level. It's interesting today, I learned at the Ring of Fire presentation today, we had FedNor boasting about their investment in the Ring of Fire, and we had the province boasting about their investment in the Ring of Fire. And oh my God, they even got together and they talked to each other. And you shouldn't believe what you read in the papers, we were told, because they really are working together on this. So maybe they are, maybe behind all this, there is this cooperation. But it is interesting, and they're actually talking about major infrastructure development. In fact, we're just bidding on a project that they've initiated, which is to build a new network of all-seasons roads for the Matawa First Nation region, which will link those communities together in advance now of the possible investment in the Ring of Fire, or certainly in conjunction with it. So that's the first time it's got down to the nitty-gritty level, well, I would say to housing and infrastructure. And it's extremely interesting. There's a really interesting proposal there to look at this, and of course this would have, and of course it goes back to the beginning, doesn't it? I mean, it goes back to, you know, before the British surveyed the heck out of this. Upper Canada was the biggest survey ever in the world, where it divided the whole country. You know, after the British lost 13 colonies, they holed up in Quebec and had to figure out what to do with the 14th one. That was us. And their analysis was not that they'd been overtaxed, but that they'd lost control of land. And the chief agent was George Washington. George Washington, you have to remember, like George Washington in 1759 fought for the British army against the French at Quebec. By 1776, he was fighting his British fellow Brits in basically a civil war in the American Revolution, because he was a surveyor. He was the youngest surveyor in American history. He was commissioned at 14 years old. He married the daughter of Lord Fairfax, who was responsible for settling Fairfax County in Virginia. And George was out there surveying off little lots and handing them out to people in the back, in the Shenandoah Valley and places like that. And the British bureaucracy showed up and said, yeah, you can't do that. That's Crown land. And nobody ever heard the term. We all know it because we're good colonial people. Crown land. That's, oh yeah, we don't touch Crown land. But anyway, George said, "What do you mean? This is my father-in-law's land. We fought for this. And in fact, his first army was raised from the people on those back lots, who were not about to lose their land either. And they rose up and marched to Boston at the beginning of that war, and that was one of the major factors. So what the British said here is, well, actually, what we have to do in advance of settlement, we have to divide Upper Canada into lots, and we'll hand the lots out one at a time to the people we think deserve them. And we have a whole series of townships in Ontario. They're all laid out with 9 concessions. They're all fronting on Lake Ontario, the initial ones. There's 9 concessions. The first concession went to the family compact, the ruling class in Toronto. Even if they never showed up, they always owned 3 or 4 lots in the 35 of the first concession. Second concession went to the officers of the British Army. Third concession went to the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and the fourth concession went to privates. The fifth concession went to sympathetic parties. My family's Dutch, so we were in the fifth concession because we moved up from New York with the British. We helped them move up, actually. So we got a farm in the fifth concession. The sixth and seventh were Scottish, and the eighth and ninth were Irish. That's how it worked. And so we had a little rebellion in 1837. It was the Scottish and Irish from the back lots coming down and saying, we can't get to the lake, which you needed to get to ship all your goods out. We don't like it. Hang 15 of them and it's over. Next. So the path forward for developing Canada is setting a table, engaging key stakeholders. So that's the first thing, is to really sit down and talk with people, and particularly First Nations. And we've just been involved in a really interesting exercise, which I'll use to demonstrate what's going on. We were actually hired by Vale, the people who took over the Thompson nickel mine. This would be 4 years ago. And what they phoned up and basically said, we're going to shut down the refining operations there and move them to Sudbury, because Sudbury's at 50% and Thompson's 50%, and we got to centralize that. Can you help us do that? And I said, well, no, we're not in that business, but we can help you replace the economy. So they said, well, what do you mean? They said, and I was just making it up, I was tap dancing. And I said, well, you're going to lose $30 million a year when those people move out. This is a town that was planned for mine workers and their families for 25,000 in 1964. At that moment, it was about 13,000. And you're going to lose 600 families. That's going to be 30 million a year. We could look at other economies that you could attract to come here and diversify. And it is a very interesting thing, that I don't know how well you know Kitimat, but Kitimat was designed by quite a famous planner in the United States called Clarence Stein, and it was planned to diversify. That may sound impossible, but he actually planned for it to evolve. And in fact, right now, it's gone from being an aluminum town over in the beginning to now being a major center for the LNG and for the First Nations expansion in the area. But Thompson, then they said, okay, could you look at that? The first thing we did is we set up, we just do what we did in Africa. We set a table with all the representatives that were involved. So we had the mayor, we had a Métis woman representing the Métis of Manitoba. We had 3 representatives from the 3 regional Aboriginal organizations. We had the mine, and we invited the province and the federal government. He said, no, we're not interested, that won't work. And we had I think we had the Chamber of Commerce. And, it was a really interesting, the very first meeting we had, the mayor chaired it because it was in Thompson, and he said, well, we're going to, I told him that, because we operate in that capacity as a neutral party, we're being paid by Valley, but we're actually bringing Valley together with the affected parties to reach a solution. So we were a secretary to this table we set up. And I said, the first thing you got to do is figure out how you're going to make decisions. And the mayor said, first thing you got to do is figure out how to make decisions. And we're going to have to vote. We're going to have consensus votes. And he said, I think the town should have 4 votes, just like that. And the Métis woman beside him said, well, that's interesting, Mr. Mayor. That would mean, well, we'll have 6. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, we have that many more people than you do in this region. So we get 6 votes. And then the next First Nation said, well, if that's the case, we get 4. And anyway, within an hour, everybody had 1 vote. And so all decisions were consensus. But it was an extremely interesting kind of moment there. And that's what needs to happen, I'd say, but I'll make a long story short. In fact, the economy is the fact that within an hour of when we defined what a region was, what made sense in terms of region, Thompson always says, we're the hub of the North. And we said, well, where's the wheel? Well, we're the hub of the North. Where's the wheel? And we actually defined the wheel carefully. Within the wheel were 40,000 Aboriginal people, all of whom go to Thompson for their services, their food, their cars, everything they need. And when you add it up, it was a huge economy that Thompson itself wasn't even acknowledging. And then we said, God, we've just discovered the census of Canada, the last census, had predominantly Aboriginal population in Thompson. I said, did you know this? And of course the mayor did know it, and people on the committee knew it, but they sort of feigned, no, we didn't realize that. And the mayor said, oh, well, when the census people were here, there just happened to be a lot of Aboriginal people in town, and they got counted. And the little Métis woman beside him said, yeah, she said, now, Mr. Mayor, you know where I live, I'm 50 miles out, and he said, don't you have a cottage on the lake there? And the mayor said, yeah, actually I do. She said, is that your second home? And he said, well, yeah, I guess it is. She said, Thompson's my second home. And I live here, and I live there too, just like you do. So that was another huge breakthrough. So really, we're working, it turns out, after you peel the layers away, and there are layers, I'm not going to say it's racist, but there's a lot of, when we did, rather than say, do you know where all these people are living, we did a map of the census and showed that predominant population was living in one neighborhood in the town. So over half the population was in one run-down it was the old camp actually that was set up before the town was built. And And, everybody had to space up to that. And housing immediately became part of the economic development. And the mine said, we'll give the land. And the mine said, we'll train people to work in the mine. And then the native people said, well, yeah, no, we were trained in 1954. I went back in 67, and I was there in 78, but there was no housing. So I went back to the reserve, and nobody called me. And then we realized, wow, training, you've got to live there. Housing and the whole situation has to be kind of revamped. By this time, the province says, wow, this is interesting, and they sat down, asked if they could come and be part of it, and they're now funding a regional infrastructure program through the whole, which is linking all those First Nations communities back into Thompson. And Thompson, in fact, is a really interesting mixed-race, mixed-income hub now of a real wheel that's turning. And I would say that situation is not dissimilar from many situations through the Mid-Canada Belt. So getting people together is really important. Developing a Mid-Canada strategy to create multiple economies. So one of the important things about resource economies is they wax and wane. So you have to use those waxings to catalyze second and third and fourth economies wherever you can. So it could be you're growing the food to feed the workers in the camp, or you're driving there's all kinds of things come out of it. And actually, we also go back to the original economies of those communities, which had been left behind because when the mine came over, they got lured into that, but they left behind trapping or agriculture or growing cocoa, that's Africa. So you go back and restore those old economies because you know they can outlast the rise and fall of the mine. And so that's really important, that multiple economies thing. Promoting local workforce development and immigration. So actually promoting immigration to the places where people are needed. And I think you already must know that when you go to any of those northern northern communities or those resource towns, they're full of South Asians and Somalis and all kinds of different people who've already discovered this a long time ago, but are not really planned for. There's certainly no facility there for them to live in for a year while they get settled. In fact, they move into a 2-bedroom apartment that's occupied by 8 people. That's how they're received here, and they put up with it. But we could be doing so much better. Planning for environment and resource extraction and infrastructure and housing simultaneously. I think I've talked about that. Identifying local, regional, provincial, national, and international responsibilities. So again, it's not just that we have to think about this as being some kind of federal responsibility, or even provincial. It's a responsibility at all levels, because these are places across this band that affect us all. And foster innovation. And I think that's just a general comment, but I think there's all kinds of potential in it. And in fact, there's been all kinds of innovation that's gone on around the mines and around the oil fields right now, and the processing of fuel and the shipping of it, and for all the bad stuff, there's some pretty interesting invention that's gone on as well. Create a more prosperous, just, sustainable Canada. I didn't write this for Justin Trudeau, by the way, but it sounds like he never said that. Remote and underserviced geographies can move towards strategic investment in infrastructure. It's difficult to predict the population growth, so you have to provide flexible planning that allows for growth. There's pressure to accommodate worker influx and rising demand for and cost of housing and infrastructure. So look at integrated sustainable housing and infrastructure strategy for workers and communities that's much less costly and looks at their long-term role there. Single economy dependency and boom-bust cycles replaced with economic diversification and post-closure planning. Land use conflicts replaced with consensual decision-making for land use and development, and a greater environmental footprint and impact due to siloed project development. Obviously, we need to really turn our attention to minimizing environmental impact. Next. So from a policy point of view, gosh, I left this to the end. I should have started it for you guys. But
2 minutes left.
Well, 2 minutes. One, very quick. One, setting the table. The need to set those tables I talked about for discussion and pushing this forward. Needs to be both top-down and bottom-up, with each scale informing the others. Next. There's the Thompson Economic Diversification Group and the people who have participated in that as an example. An informed multi-stakeholder participatory process, etc. I told you about that. Next. Creating multiple economies, policy for that. Next. Promoting local workforce development, and I'll leave a copy of this for people that are interested, so you can leave it that way. But unreserved population is expected to increase by 64% by 2026. So we're back to contact levels of population, and we're now exceeding those. Serious actions required. Promoting immigration, actually directing immigration to Mid-Canada, I think makes a lot of sense. Next. Planning simultaneously for environment, resource extraction, infrastructure, housing. So I'm just elaborating those main points I've just made and creating those starter towns and looking at regional planning in a proper way as we've been doing in the Toronto region. Next. And identifying local, regional, provincial, national, and international responsibilities. Next. And looking, there's the international picture, again, next. And there are the kinds of responsibilities that might fall to the various levels of government in a very broad way. And that, I think, could contribute to the situation. That's it.
Thank you, John.